Our first speaker tonight is going to be the Menifee City Council mayor, former mayor, current councilman, Wallace Edgerton. And Wally has been a stockbroker and a university professor on political science and a public administrator for over 20 years. His knowledge of local planning and development issues has served him on the Long Beach City Council for 17 years and on the Menifee City Council since 2008. So he has a long background dealing with this issue and how it's changed over his time in office. So welcome, Wally, or Wallace.
Well, thank you, David and Christine, and I want to thank the Patriots Coalition for inviting me here this evening, and all the other coalitions that are part of this program. And an evaluation of the subject matter of the sustainability development, and I'm a little bit newer to appreciating what this is all about. I believe the focus here today is on the role of local government as viewed by an international council with the acronym of ICLA, which I understand stands for icky. But I have been given a softball on this particular panel. My job is to try to place this movement in some historical and constitutional perspective as we try to understand why the Patriots Coalition and all these other coalitions are so alarmed by the sustainability movement. And indeed, as you sit here tonight, when you consider it's really quite complex and deeper than that, as you feel the anger, the frustration, the sense of discontent that's kind of sweeping across our country. The idea of sustainability through development was more recently, as David pointed out, identified through Assembly Bill 32, and it originated in the 1900s within the United Nations as Agenda 21. It is a world view ideology that assumes mankind is in danger and that the sustainability of the human race as we know it depends upon how we deal with the Earth's environment and how we as governments influence the behavior of humans in order to achieve that goal. It is a top-down strategy, and while emphasizing local planning, the ultimate authority comes from central control. It is in the final analysis the eventual culmination of central control with its inherent deference to the state as opposed to the individual that has the opposition of this ideology so alarmed. Most would agree that this movement, which began with the United Nations, was based on the very best intentions. But other national and international ideologies emphasizing central control and the nation state over the individual have ended up quite tragically. The most notable of those, of course, would be Hegel and Marx and communism, which emanated from the left political side. And then you can see Nietzsche and fascism emanating from the right political spectrum. But the writer Hannah Arendt, in her nonfiction work on totalitarianism, points out that both of these left and right movements were predicated on the equality of conditions of the masses, and that has been the method of central control, whether you're talking about the pharaohs or dictators or any time in history. This movement of sustainability is not about equality of opportunity, which is a democratic idea, but rather it is concerned about the equality and condition of the masses. And that is in essence a totalitarian idea. This idea of sustainability may appear innocent enough and perhaps innocuous in its present state, but it has the virulent seeds of oppression within its context, and its allure is a guarantee of more security, more predictability, but its price tag comes with your individuality surrendered and much of your freedoms surrendered. It is antithetical to the thoughts of our constitutional founding fathers, and Americans need to be made aware that the asking price is far too high. It is our freedom. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher, cautioned us about putting too much emphasis on security. He said, if all you want is security, you can find security in a dungeon. So there are other things that we hopefully aspire to. In 1949, George Orwell wrote, as you know, that prophetic nightmarish vision of the world, and it became a classic novel. And Orwell had been a socialist in Spain. He was fighting against the fascists. He was a socialist. And in the end, he became disenchanted with both sides, both the fascist and the socialist. And he was concerned, in his book, he reminded us that what they're really after is our mind. And a lot of textbooks will, when they write about totalitarianism, they will tell you that totalitarianism means the total control of the culture and the politics of a society or a country. That is not the essence of what totalitarianism means. That word total in totalitarianism means that that system is after the totalitarian, or after the totality of you. It is after the total individual. It is not enough for you to yield to the laws. It is not enough for you to say, I'll do what you ask me to do. They are deeply concerned about how you think. And that is part of totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt, in her non-fictional book, Not Totalitarianism, would point this out. And she would point out that you have to be concerned because in the beginning these movements seem rather innocuous, but eventually they want to put the state above everything, including the family, including the church, or whatever other concerns you might have. Taking a look now at the Declaration of Independence and getting a feel a little bit of how our founding fathers might have looked at this sustainability. Lord Acton, who came, by the way, later than our Constitution, would remind us that power tends to corrupt and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the greater the centralization of the government, the greater the power. Most human beings have accepted a submissive, centralized government since we've had nation states. We have had great thinkers who've come before us who've helped us break that sense of submission to the state. One of these was John Locke, that 17th century philosopher who talked about life, liberty, and property, and that was paraphrased by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When asked, asking John Locke, when asked if he was loyal to his king, he said, I am loyal to my king as long as my king is loyal to me. And for that, John Locke had to flee England for his life. The Declaration of Independence of 1774 was a radical document when it was written. And you should remember that as you sit here tonight, it is a radical document. It will always be a radical document. The core thesis was that you, the individual, matter, and that no king or king should have absolute power. If a king or a government abuses their power by not respecting your inherent rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you have the right, indeed you have the obligation, to overthrow that government, and if necessary, with violent force. Jefferson was no wuss. The Constitutional Convention, when you look at that, it's quite different. The Constitution is a conservative document. It was conservative then, it is conservative now. It was written, as you know, in 1787. The saddest part The saddest part of the United States Constitution is that we have not followed it. The quintessential message of the Founding Fathers was that you should have a decentralized government with local control. The states, not the national government, would make the decisions about most things, including the police powers and their local economies. The national or central government was not to be trusted. It was to be divided into three branches of government as checks and balances against the potential of any attempt at the concentration of power. All power given the national government was delegated power from the states, and any power not delegated or enumerated in that Constitution was reserved to the states. Now, if you look at the Bill of Rights, and you see where it came from, because the distrust of a potentially strong central government was so pervasive among the delegates, and even more so among the general population, that it was understood that even before ratification of the Constitutional Convention's efforts, that certain amendments would be immediately passed following that ratification. And by the way, most of you probably have been to college. Most of those textbooks are liberal. Most of them adhere or admire centralized control, and many of the textbooks will tell you that our Founding Fathers wanted stronger, not stronger, that they did, but that they wanted strong central government. They did not. And if anybody wants to follow up in discussion to understand why, that's my point. I'll be happy to elaborate. Those were our first 10 amendments, those first amendments that had been anticipated, and they are our Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was to protect the individual from any abuse from the central government, and in addition use that Bill of Rights to build a fence around that little potential monster and see that it did not grow into a Frankenstein. You were to be loyal to your country, but never, never trust your government, consisting of those elected officials and bureaucrats who have an inclination to want to concentrate power at the potential cost of the citizens' freedom. Now, when you look at the government today and where we are, it is not the government intended by your Founding Fathers. The government that we have today is not a reflection of that Constitution. And so the question is, why? Why not? Because I will point out 4 reasons why our nation has morphed into a government that was not intended by our Founding Fathers, and briefly discuss 3 of them. The first reason is the growth of population. It complicates governance, but it's not the primary reason we're in the position we are today, where many people would consider the sustainability issue and say, ho-hum, what's the big deal? The other 3 are judicial review, grants and aid, and the interpretation of the courts of the 14th Amendment. Let's take a look at judicial review. There is no mention whatsoever of judicial review in our Constitution. It is something that has evolved over time without a vote and has dramatically taken away the right of Americans to vote. The U.S. Constitution is brief. It's a rather simple document made up of 7 articles and 27 amendments. The first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights, which is often considered of one piece with the original Constitution, and this, of course, was anticipated. The bulk of the Constitution consists of Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. Article 1 was the primary concern. It was the priority. That's why it's called Article 1. It concerns the legislative body. It's where the Founding Fathers wanted the bulk of the power to reside. Why? Because you had access to it, because you could vote for them, you could vote against them, you could throw them out of office. They wanted to make sure that you could get at them. And Article 1 and particularly Section 8 of Article 1, where they talk about the powers of Congress, very clearly tells you what our founding fathers intended for our government. The Article 2 concerns the executive branch, or the president, and it is of great significance, but it is clearly dependent upon the legislative branch to be functional. Since this branch is headed by one man, they did not wish to take any chance that he might become a king. By the way, there were exceptions to the dominant view of decentralized control at the Constitutional Convention, Alexander Hamilton being the most notable, but that view was in a minority. Article 3 was much shorter, and it is about our courts. The Supreme Court would be the final appellate court and would usually handle rather esoteric matters, usually involving ordinary people. For example, it would handle matters of diverse citizenship between nations and our individual states, and conflicts between states and national governments. One of its primary tasks was to act as a check against the possibility of the growth in power of the other two branches of government. Again, the Founding Fathers were clearly sending a message. Don't trust government. Be loyal to your country, which is different than the people who sit in your government. Indeed, the duties of the court were so limited that the first two Chief Justices quit because they said they had more important things to do. The potential thorn in this innocuous appearing Article 3 was described by Yates, who was a delegate at the convention and himself Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of New York. He pointed out that the arbiter in any dispute over the U.S. Supreme Court would be determined by the court itself, which in fact in fact it should be judged by the legislative body, which in turn was answerable to the people at the ballot box. Yates went on to say that without any bad intentions, the court could evolve into the most powerful and independent judicial body ever created under the sun. While highly respected, the delegates did not heed Yates' warning. And consequently, as you sit here tonight, the United States Supreme Court is the most powerful, independent court ever created under the sun. And it would have been anathema to our founding fathers if they could be here tonight and see the position of our court vis-a-vis what their plan was for you. As you sit here tonight, the founding fathers would point out that this court has and can right over the top of both minorities and majorities. It is an undemocratic body that imposes its centralized power on all Americans by 5 of 9 unelected and unselected justices who are unknown to the average American and answer to nobody. Much of what Americans must answer for today has not been determined by an elected legislative body, as intended by our founding fathers, but rather by an unelected court, which is accountable to no one. Thomas Jefferson would admonish you to change that. It was not intended that the court discuss personal matters such as abortion and contraceptives and prayer in school. That was not intended at all for that great court. That came later through evolution. A second reason for the increase of the centralization of our government is grants and aid. Grants and aid have allowed our central government a rationale for collecting more and more taxes in order to provide most of what our founding fathers intended that we provide for ourselves locally in our states, in our counties, and in our towns. Grants suck away the ability to make local decisions where the people live and transfers it to faraway bureaucrats who cannot understand our way of life and do not care. Again, the founders of our Constitution knew that when you sacrifice local control, you give up much of your individuality. A slow evolution towards centralization can be insidious, and a good example might be a little test I give my students, and that's in reference to fiscal policy. When you're talking about, let us say, a recession or depression, and we talk about what some people refer to as Keynesian economics. You don't have to refer to Keynesian economics, it's just fiscal policy. What you usually use in fiscal policy is a combination of trying to provide more government spending and lowering taxes. But in a hypothetical example, let us say that you have a recession and that you can use either the instrument of greater government spending or lowering taxes. And let us say that regardless of which one of those instruments you use, you reach the same goal. Indeed, you reach the same positive goal. You reach the same level of employment. You reach the same desired level of GDP, the gross domestic product. So the question is, if you reach the same goal, the same desirable goal, the same GDP, and the same level of employment, whether you increase government spending or whether you decrease taxes, what difference does it make? It makes a huge difference. Because when you have government spending make that determination, it is the government that makes the decision of how, what, when, why happens. When it is a lowering of your taxes that makes the determination of that GDP and employment, it will be you. It will be you, the citizen, who makes that determination. And the other issue, and the last issue, would be the 14th Amendment. And I would simply point out there that what happened is that the courts decided tragically, using the 14th Amendment primarily and other amendments as well, to decide that the Bill of Rights, which was until the 1920s, clearly meant to only put a fence around the national government, the central government. But the courts have chosen to chip away at the Bill of Rights, and now they wrap it around the states, so that now the national government, as an instrument of the Supreme Court, as an instrument of the national government, will interpret our local laws. And that's how they got into such personal things as your flag, and into contraception, and into school prayer. That is how that occurred, and they've gone through almost the entire Bill of Rights. One of the few that still stands is the Second Amendment. They haven't been able to break that down yet, but they're working on it. And so in conclusion, I would simply tell you, if Madison, if Hamilton, if Jay were here tonight and they were listening to a presentation on sustainability, the development, this program that you're concerned about, they would be vehement and they would simply say, for your freedom, for your country, for yourself, don't do it. Thank you.